Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Well, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. Here with host Jimmy Hinton, and you see the blank seat. My mom is sick, so she's not here with us today. And we have a very special guest with us, Judge Aquilina. Judge, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, and tell your mother I'm sorry I missed her, and I hope she feels better.
I will, thank you. So I wanted to jump right in, and I've actually been wanting to interview you for quite a while. And specifically, we'll get into this, but talking about the letter that you decided to read from Larry Nassar. And I think that was such an important decision that you made for a whole host of reasons. And I'll share those with you as we go on in the interview. But first of all, maybe introduce yourself and talk about how this case with Larry Nassar, which is probably one of the most famous, most broadcast cases on child sexual abuse, probably in the history of the United States. How did this land in your court?
All right. Well, first, I'm Rosemary Aquilina. I'm the 30th Circuit Court Judge for Ingham County, which is all of the county of Ingham, which is East Lansing, Michigan. And this case, I'm a general trial division judge. There are 9 judges in our bench, but there are 5 in general trial division, which is criminal and civil, big cases. And so what happens is when there's a case that is coming into the court, it gets filed with the clerks, and then it goes into the computer, and the computer, whether it's civil or criminal, assigns it to a judge. It's completely random. And so at the end of the month, we all have about even cases. And at the end of the year, we have even cases. It's by computer. So this was a random act of the computer and God. And that's how I got the case.
Wow. That's incredible. So did you realize, right away, did you realize the gravity of this case and just how significant it was?
No, I don't research cases. I don't know that many judges do. We don't have the time, nor do we want to do that. I don't research cases before they hit my bench. And I'm really a clean slate, not as clean as a jury because there are motions and other things that get filed. So we know things about the case, but as judges, we're able to sift through that. But there are defendants who want a bench trial, which is by judge alone. He wanted a jury trial. And when I started getting all of the media requests and my staff said, do you know what case you have? The media is calling. All these things are happening. And I said, no, tell me about it. Why? And then I started to realize because of some of the names. But initially, I didn't know the gravity. And certainly no one knew the extent of what was going on. And I just have to say, when I talked to the lawyers, the first time I talked to them, I learned there was an absolute defense from his counsel, right? And they said it was medical, and the prosecutors insisted, no, it was criminal. I thought, wow, what a terribly interesting case. It will be a cross between a criminal and a medical malpractice, which is, as a judge, terribly interesting because even in civil cases, when we get medical malpractice, they're really fascinating. And just hear a lot of different testimony. You get advised of a lot of information that you don't normally hear. So I was looking forward to the information, and that battle. Is it legal? Is it medical? Is it criminal? And so that's what I knew at first.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really interesting too, because I read Rachel Denhollander's book, which was phenomenal. And she talks about how challenging it is to prove. Basically, she had to spend a couple years as a victim and as an attorney and as a researcher, and do all the legwork and all this research because the bar is so high to be able to prove malpractice. I don't know if that's the right terminology, but the process that she had to go through personally was excruciating. And maybe you can talk to that. Like, why is it so difficult for victims um, to to prove? Why do they have to prove that? And this is kind of personal to me because we have a pediatrician in Cambria County, just north of us, that was another really huge national case. And this man, in his 70s, he was finally arrested, actually in 2018, right after the Nassar sentencing. He had some charges brought against him, and this shocked people. He's a pediatrician also, or was, here in Somerset, and he had, I mean, dozens and dozens, and they think hundreds of victims. He was doing the same exact thing as Larry Nassar with parents in the room. Same story. I think this is far more common. So maybe speak to people who are victims of these kinds of crimes and the parents of victims, and tell them what the process is to seek justice.
It's complicated, but and it's a mixed bag of answers. So let me start with Dr. Nassar, who no longer bears the title, thankfully, of doctor, but Mr. Nassar. And there was a doctor who's deceased now, Anderson, I believe is his name, at U of M. They're finding hundreds of men who were assaulted under the guise of medical treatment. And I think we're going to keep finding these cases now that it's surfaced. But first of all, you have a person in a position of trust. We are all trained to believe doctors, lawyers, teachers, people who are highly educated, right? That has to stop. That just has to stop. We need to teach our children, question everyone, everything. You have a right to say no. You have a right to your body. You have a right to informed consent. As soon as a child learns, mom, dad, yes, no, they can learn body, my body. Explain, no, don't touch me. Even to a pediatrician, it's important. And I think since I've taken my kids, since the Nassar case to the doctors really take extra time to say, I'm going to give you a shot. Here's why. Can I touch you? And we need to ask permission. If I saw you at the mall and we recognize each other, if I wanted to hug you or you wanted to hug me just to say hello, you need to say, can I give you a hug? And we need to teach our children, you have a right to not be touched. You have a right to seek permission or ask for permission to be touched. You have a right to know why you're being touched. Otherwise, we have
Totally agree.
Silent culture of abuse. In fact, my oldest daughter with my grandchildren, she will not allow them to sit on Santa's lap. Not because Santa's a bad guy, not because we're accusing Santa of anything, but because it's that subliminal message, which we also need to start looking for. What's the subliminal message there? It's okay for a young girl to sit on an old man's lap who she does not know, does not have a relationship with, and he's been built up to be the giver of gifts. Well, sometimes Santa can give the wrong gift, and Santa comes in all forms. So we can't have to teach them. Be aware, get the information. You have a right to say no.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And we have these conversations with our kids. It's so important. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and speaking, I'm going to divert a little bit because you mentioned your kids in the conversations. One of the things that I just did because I did it and didn't know that it was a really good thing, but I think it's a great thing. I have 5 children. I don't always agree with them. They don't always agree with me, but I have really good siblings. I have 2 brothers and a sister, and I've always taught my children, if there's something you can't tell me for whatever reason, I don't care what it is, you can go to them. They're your safe people. They won't tell me. They will help you and they will not tell me.
Yes.
So I think we always need to have somebody that truly is trustworthy that your children can go to, because children, and this happened in not just the Nassar case, but I've had hundreds, maybe thousands of these cases now, not as large as Nassar, but many of them brutally worse. And children feel like they've disappointed their parents because they were assaulted. And so they need to be able to, if they can't go to a parent or guardian, they need to be able to have a safe person who they can tell and who they can get help from. So that's just a little side note. But
Yeah,
when you
I totally agree with that too. And I think that applies to the church culture as well too, where you have these highly toxic power dynamics and people who they rank themselves way above the rest of the congregation, which I think is just poisonous. But in my church, um, myself and the elders stand before the church every now and then, and we say, if anyone makes you feel uncomfortable, find someone to talk to. It doesn't even have to be us. Find somebody who you trust. Find somebody who will come back and who will tell us. And we promise you, it won't go beyond us. Any confidential information, and we will take care of it. We will stop it. We'll snuff it out. We have zero tolerance for it. And I think you're so right. Our kids need to hear that too. It's not just mom and dad, because sometimes for a whole host of reasons, they may not feel comfortable talking to us. And that's okay. They need to know that that's okay.
Well, and we need the layering. So we need to give schools permission to teach this kind of subject and not ask permission from the parents, because parents can be abusers too. We simply need to integrate it into our educational system. So we have layers of information that go to children. So part of the problem that Rachel Denhollander faced was, is it medical? Because this was a trusted person and he didn't ask permission. And as she grew up, as she became a lawyer, she realized that, yes, this was criminal, and she had a gut, and she followed it. So, my hat's always going to be off to her. Yay, Rachel. And that's her story, and people can talk to her about that. But it is so very common that because it's somebody, a distrusted adult against a child, that we trust the adult and we don't listen to the child. So we have to listen, because we need to make it easier, because otherwise we are again victimizing the victim, and it happens over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And then, there's the whole malpractice. So there's the criminal versus the civil arena, where this is malpractice, and where does it cross the line? Well, this procedure clearly was malpractice, because it wasn't generally accepted for this age group, first of all. But second, it wasn't used for a right medical purpose. And he was getting, the statute speaks, you have to look at the elements of the statute, and it speaks to using this for for sexual exploitation, for his own sexual needs, plus their age, they couldn't consent. I mean, some of them were 6 years old, and he groomed them for years and years. Trinae Gonzer, he assaulted something like 859 times, so, and because it was started when she was very young. And then people say, well, how did that happen? And it's true in all of these cases. The Anderson case at U of M, the Nassar case, the case that you were talking about, we have to learn about what is grooming. And so what is grooming? Grooming is when someone builds a relationship of trust and an emotional connection with a child or a young person, so that they can manipulate, exploit, and abuse them. And it doesn't have to be a young person. It can really be any person. And people are groomed, and then they are sexually abused. They're exploited in any number of different ways. They're trafficked. And so we have to learn about grooming. What are the signs? And that is exactly what happened in this case. In all of these cases, actually. Person of trust says, I'm the only one that can heal you, and I'm going to bring you to greatness, and I will have you achieve your goals. And if you don't do this, then something bad will happen. And if you don't comply, then you won't be who you're supposed to be. All of these things. And then the parents, it wasn't just the children who were groomed. In all these cases, the parents were groomed to believe, I'm the one that's going to help your child. And then could they see what was happening? No, because in the examination room, the doctor's body was blocking. There were loose clothing was placed on the victims. The towels were stacked. There was a positioning so that parents couldn't see, and the parents often were in the room.
Yeah.
But the child, they have silent communication. Silent communication can no longer happen. The child is looking at the parent saying, this is hurt, this hurts, oh, I want to cry. And the parent is saying, oh, no, you're fine, you're fine. It's all through eyes. It's not, what's hurting you? What is he doing? Why are you uncomfortable? What's happening? And so that conversation is not happening. It is the silence. And so silence has the wrong idea. The girl is saying, or in cases, the boy was saying, it hurts with their eyes. And what's he doing to me? And then they're looking at the parent. The parent's expression is saying, it's okay. I've given permission, so it's okay.
Yeah.
And that silent communication is deadly.
Yeah, I want to speak to this a little bit because I don't know if you know this or how much you know this, but I specifically research abuse in plain sight. So, the techniques behind it, the science behind it,
Mhm.
and I'm not convinced that Larry Nassar positioned his body in even a majority of the cases. I think the parents fill in the gaps and they assume that he was blocking the position. But in studying abuse techniques and writing letters, hundreds of letters back and forth with my dad in prison, this is number one. I think we need to say that it's incredibly common. Abusers, child sexual predators, most often will abuse victims at some point in front of other people, and that's intentional. That's not accidental. It's not like they couldn't control themselves and they can't hold back. They know exactly what they're doing. And I mean, I have a detailed manual that my dad has written from prison to me that talks about techniques step by step, what he's thinking, what he knows the kid is thinking, what the parent is thinking, how he knows that the parents can't tell that he's doing this, how he actually moves himself and positions himself so that they can see. That's very intentional. And so there's a very sophisticated science behind this that magicians use all the time. And the complexity in this is absolutely astounding. But all that to say, I think it's so important that parents realize there are basic things that they can do. Like nobody's going to learn these techniques because they're highly sophisticated. They're really complicated. But I had written a blog post about this shortly after all the Nassar stuff. And I said, there are basically three things that parents can do when they walk into a doctor's office or anywhere else for that matter. Watch the eyes, watch the hands, and listen to the words in that order. And what I mean by that is if you watch the person's eyes, Larry Nassar, his eyes look at children knowingly, just like adults, perverted adults who are checking out the teenage girl walking through the shopping mall. And when I talk to girls, when I do trainings, or talk to women, I say, every one of you women know what I'm talking about because you can feel when somebody's checking you out and there's no misinterpreting somebody who's gawking at you and thinking sexually about you. That same look is the same look that predators give to children, including Larry Nassar and everybody else. Rachel Denhollander talked about how he had an erection and, was very visibly aroused, and her mom didn't fill in the gaps. And like she remembered it, but didn't really fill in the gaps until later. So watching the eyes, watching the hands, including all 10 digits. If even one of the 10 fingers disappears, the parents need to get up and physically move themselves so that they can see all 10 fingers at all 10 times. Having blankets over top and, all the stuff that Larry was doing with putting blankets over top or going up shorts, that's not acceptable ever. And parents need to know that it's okay. Like you said, they need to have a voice. The kids need to have a voice. And then the last one, listen to the words. Larry Nassar was using all kinds of techniques when he's talking to the parents. When I'm reading these stories that the victims and the parents are talking publicly about, I'm like, I know exactly. Like I read about this in these letters from my dad. Like Larry was holding their spotlight of attention, talking about science homework, making cheesy jokes, the dad jokes, all the weird stuff that he was doing. That was all intentional. And has no place in the doctor's office, quite frankly.
But that's where we need to have this conversation and flip the script and change the teaching that just because someone has a degree does not mean they're right. You do not lose your voice ever. And what you're saying
Right.
really is trust your gut.
Yes.
And there should be, if it's a red flag, if there's any boundary that a parent can't cross to reach their child, even in the doctor's office. So you should be able to stand right next to your child, not across the room, not in the waiting room.
Yeah.
Even in a sports arena, in a gymnastics floor, in playing tennis, whatever they're practicing, if there's anything where a parent can't go, where the child is, like the locker room with the coach, I should be able to walk in and hear what's being said, look at what's being seen. I had a
Yeah.
situation with my daughter. My middle child wanted to do gymnastics, and we almost joined one of the gyms where Nassar was. I didn't know who he was until the case, but fortunately now I know we dodged that bullet. But we ended up at a cheerleading. It was an elite cheerleading program. And my daughter said, well, I want to go to college on a scholarship. I really want to do this. I like it. I like it better than gymnastics. So I want to do this. So I walked in and I said, if this is like Dance Moms, I don't want to do this. So tell me about your program. And I was assured that they helped them with homework. They were kind. They did all these things. It wasn't what I've seen. And keep in mind, this is 4, 5, 6 years before Nassar.
Yeah.
Anyways, and so my daughter starts, and things I think are going well. And some of her demeanor changes, and I listen to conversations. And then I walk in when I'm there. I go early to practices, and I go beyond the doors where parents are allowed to see what's going on with this competitive cheer. And what I witnessed were coaches being rude, mean, pitting girls against each other, not believing one girl because they'd say, work it out. And ultimately, they'd watch the girls fight. And it was like watching the training of pit bulls, which I've heard a lot of nasty testimony on illegal dogfighting and racing. And
Wow.
so, yeah, it was exactly the same thing. And I said, I have to bring my child out of this. And my daughter was mad. She's very mad at me. And I talked to the coaches, because you really should talk to the coaches and try to work things out. Maybe what you're seeing isn't right, but I'm not going to be groomed to believe what's happening in my eyes is not right. And that's part of grooming.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
I kept her in a few more weeks, and then she started to really feel uncomfortable, and something got stolen from her by another girl. And then the coaches did not intervene. They just said, well, and again, it was work it out. And this got really ugly. And I said, you know what? I'm the mom. And I pulled her out. And I think that, and it took her weeks, maybe a year even, for her to not be mad at me about it. But that place ultimately shut down,
Mm.
because when I started pulling out, and people knew who I was, and, I was very vocal about what I thought was wrong. And I
Yeah.
wasn't going to shut it down, but people started to really look and go behind the doors. I went behind the doors. I watched where it says no parents allowed. Why? I have a lawful right, a constitutionally protected right to raise my child, to see what's happening. You should never, never be away from your child and be told there's some kind of boundaries. Now, if they're in a game of soccer and you can't go in because they're playing, that's a whole different game, right? But not when someone is allegedly training them. They should never be alone with the coach. They should never have supervision that allows them to fight or say harmful things or do harmful things. They should never come out of practice unhappy. Their demeanor shouldn't change. Parents need to look for all of those signs and then really stay away. One of the things I talk about too is really stay away from the why question. I think we all ask questions like why, but when you are concerned about someone and you want to get the full story, it's one of the reasons I've always said, what would you like me to know? How can I help? That
Mhm.
is an open-ended question. And I can tell you that attorneys always ask, may I approach? I say, sure. They say, how'd you get that information? My client didn't tell me that. It's because, and it was true when I was in practice, I got a lot of information from my clients that helped me. And it's because that open-ended question, when you say, why didn't you do your homework?
It sounds
Why?
accusatory.
It's accusatory. And
Yeah.
you can get part of the story, but you're never going to get all the story. And so why shames and blames? Why needs to be in the house of science and retire there? But we
Yeah.
shouldn't use it when we are questioning anybody who's been assaulted or who's troubled. Because why? And they're already blaming themselves. If something has happened, they're already blaming themselves. If you come down on them and you blame them further, it only leads to them remaining in a bad situation, cutting, bulimia, suicide, because they internalize it and they must release it.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more with you. Totally agree. And I was glad that you said parents have a constitutional right to be where their kids are, to be able to raise them and support them. Because I think a lot of people don't know that. And we just assume that because an organization says do not enter past this point, that we don't even question it. Most people, there's like, oh, okay, because that's back where kids are changing or whatever, what in their mind, or they're training, and they don't want parents to interrupt or whatever. But I think it's so important, and we are those parents too. We follow our kids wherever they go. They're not alone with coaches. We are at every single one of our kids' practices, every single game. They don't go alone. They don't go without us, and we don't make it awkward. It's not like this. We're hovering and waiting for somebody to slip up. We're just present, and in our kids' minds, which is true. I mean, we're there to support them. We're there to encourage them, to cheer them on, and we're there. If they get hurt, nobody's going to have to scramble to find us. We're there.
Parents must be the voice of their children. And as adults, we need to be the voice of anybody without a voice, whether it's the elderly, someone who's handicapped, someone who is a minor. It just doesn't matter. We need to be the voice for those who don't have a voice. And as a parent, yeah, be present, be there. I was always the parent since I've had children, and my oldest is 38. I was always the one at school who I was there. I was going to ask more questions. I wasn't going to sign the waivers where they're going on a field trip and it basically says, sign this because if your kid dies, it's not our fault. Well, I never signed those. I'd say, well, I'm going to keep my kid home, or I'm going to adjust this. And if that's a requirement, I'm not signing it and they're not going. I didn't like those waivers. As a lawyer, I know what it means. And then I'm held as a lawyer to a higher standard if something happens and I file a suit, because they'll say, well, you signed it, you should have known. So I'm the school parent who shudders. The principal sees me and they're saying, oh, it's her again. I'm telling you all, be that parent, be the voice of change and safety for all.
Yeah. Again, totally agree. This is so important for people to hear this.
Well, let me just add, can I just add to this? Because
Absolutely.
in my practice, when I've been a judge for 16 years. When I left practice, I did a lot of family law, criminal, civil. I did a lot of different things, but I also did about 20 years of child abuse neglect cases. Sometimes it was the good parent I represented, sometimes the bad parent, sometimes the child. I was in whatever role they appointed me to. When I left, I had 400 cases, 400 files, just me alone. Okay. And so it's really important that parents know that if you do not become the voice, if you are not the voice of protection for your child, if you have a blind eye and you let abuse going on, that you should know, whether it's in an abusive relationship you're in and they're abusing the child, or a gym is abusing the child, if you know, you can get charged with failure to protect. CPS can come in and remove your child. And it's no joke. So be the voice, make sure your children are safe. And then if somebody reports you or your child gets into a situation where CPS investigates, they at least know you did everything you could do, because you don't want to go through that process. We need to protect our children. And parental termination is no joke. If you don't protect your child, and you should have, you let them be abused by the boyfriend, the coach, whoever, because you didn't want to intervene, it wasn't your place, whatever. Parents have all sorts of excuses. And I'm not talking about most parents, I'm talking about the few that are out there, but understand it can turn really quickly. The child can end up in foster care, living with another relative. There can be parental termination. There can be a couple of years of hell that you have to go through. Just be the voice up front, do the right things, and don't worry about it. But CPS is there if you need to report. It might be that a gym is doing the bad things, or a school is. Call protective services. They will investigate it, and they will never, ever ask you in court or anywhere, were you the one that reported? You don't have to answer that question. No one can ask you that question. Why? Because we don't want people to stop reporting. We want to have people report even if they're wrong. It's okay to be wrong. This is about safety of our children. And that's the thing with Rachel Denhollander. No one listened to her. No one listened to the
Hmm.
coach before. If somebody would have listened, believed, reported 30 years ago, these are not new rules. Okay.
Yeah.
30 years ago, if somebody would have listened, hundreds, because I think in the Nassar case, it's now up to 517. Um,
Wow.
and there's so many other cases now that hundreds have come forward because of the strength of those sister survivors. But we all need to be looking out for inappropriate relationships. Is somebody being trafficked? Doctors need to be retrained. Teachers need to be retrained. So we see the signs. If there's an older man with a very young girl who looks older than she is, who's constantly taking her to the gynecologist, there's a lot of infections, who's wearing things that really are, for someone who's 30 or 40 and they're 14, there's probably a problem there. Report it. If you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're right, you save a life.
I'm glad you said that too, because in the church world, especially, where you do have mandated reporters, people still refuse to report. And I consult with churches, and I tell people right up front, I'm like, I'm a mandated reporter, so whatever you tell me, you can not report it. That's fine. One way or the other, it's getting reported. And I have no problem doing that. It's the law. And like, I'm not going to apologize for that. But, this is a big theme that comes up. What if I'm wrong? What if I report this and I'm wrong? And I flip that on them immediately. And I say, what if you're not,
Right.
you know, like, look at what happens in every one of these cases
Yeah.
where these guys get away with it because people are hesitant to report, or they are reported and they get the whole support of the community. The doctor from just one county over that I told you about, he was reported clear back in the 90s, and the community came out and they had this ribbon ceremony. They came in support of him. There were dozens of victims, is my understanding. I know it was at least a handful, but I think it was dozens. It was quite a few victims who came forward, and the community shut that down immediately. And they came out and they said, "No, he's a good doctor. He's respected. Uh, I would send my kids. I have sent my kids. I've been in the room, so I know that nothing happened. That's a big farce." And so the community rallied, and they had this massive ribbon ceremony where hundreds and hundreds of people came out in support of the doctor. The medical board, they reviewed his license, or they stopped it for a short time, and then they reinstated his license. He went on to practice medicine, abusing possibly and likely hundreds more victims, clear up until 2018 when he was finally arrested. Um, it is not okay to not report. If you meet the threshold of reasonable suspicion, it is never okay to not report. You have to report.
There's no consequence to reporting because they don't want that chilling effect. And, I've had situations where I've said, I haven't heard from someone, or I think something's not right. Could you do a safety check? And, what's wrong with the safety check? They do that all the time. And they just need to know about it. Law enforcement can't be everywhere. CPS can't be everywhere. We need to be the eyes, the ears, and the voice for our children. And, there's elder
Yeah.
abuse. I've witnessed a lot of elder abuse. And there needs to, I actually teach in the law school, child abuse, neglect, and elder law. And we all need to look for the signs of abuse regardless of who it is. And with children, some adult asking, what's your schedule, what's your family schedule, even something as small as that can be a grooming behavior, because they want to know when the child is alone, when do they have access.
Yeah.
So we have to be very vigilant, teach our children not to give out information. Don't have children wear things with their name on it so that a predator can say, hey, Stephen, hey, Sally. And then a child will say, oh, they know my name. They must know my mommy and daddy. And so there's so many things that we can do. It's not just in the sports world. I see cases every walk of life, every occupation, every age, every, it's black, white, Hispanic. You can't
Yeah.
say it's one culture or another. It's everybody.
Yeah.
It's subject to it, and everybody can be a predator. You can't. If I had to draw a picture of a predator, I couldn't, because it's the person next door looking. It's not someone that you can say, oh, that person looks homeless, they must be a predator. A homeless person probably looks like a homeless person because they're homeless and they're a great person. They just fell on hard times. You cannot define people by how they look.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of our interview with Judge Aquilina. Next week, she'll be discussing the letter that she read from Larry Nassar in court and why she decided to read the letter. I think that letter has huge implications for us, so stay tuned for next week.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.